Welcome to our production where we discuss Alberta's political landscape. I'm joined by Seth, the VP of Youth for Sherwood Park's UCP. We'll be discussing the proposed Alberta Sheriff's Police Service, and we'll also be discussing the upcoming protests by the Alberta Federation of Labour. The service proposed during it was the Alberta Next panel 8 months ago. And so the first question we'll be discussing is how effective would a Alberta police service be in combating crime in Alberta? I think that Danielle proposed it in the first place. The main component of it was the rural communities. The video I watched discussed how a lot of our municipalities, like Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, have their own municipal police forces, and those work independently from the RCMP and are effective with their resources and are paid by the municipalities. And so I think that's the biggest concern, the biggest reason why Danielle is bringing this idea in the first place is because there are municipalities like here in Sherwood Park that don't have our own police force, and we are solely restricted by the resources and the capabilities of the federal RCMP. And I also think that another reason Danielle was so encouraging for this idea of an Alberta police force, it was to reinforce the Sovereign Alberta Within a United Canada Act, which allowed the provincial government to basically push back against federal legislation that it deemed harmful to Alberta. So I think that's one of the reasons she wanted the police force, because it made it easier for Alberta to determine what it wanted to enforce and its top priorities when it comes to policing. So I give that question to you of how the effectiveness of Alberta police force.
Well, one thing I'll say is someone who I'd say is fairly knowledgeable on the matter of policing and the RCMP. The RCMP is a very decentralized force. There's, the RCMP gets individual contracts with provinces to do provincial policing, and then they also have individual contracts with municipalities to police them, right? They have a contract with Strathcona County for policing here, for example. And these all have their own terms, which can be adjusted very well. I do agree that the federal government in Ottawa has been undercutting the police. Actually, under the Trudeau government, they did plan a fairly substantial budget cut to the RCMP. So there is the matter of funding that is the issue. And then the other thing, of course, is RCMP officers in comparison to other agencies here in Alberta they don't have high enough pay to justify people taking the risk of joining the RCMP, because it is a very risky job, of course. And I think that there is a merit to having a provincial police force so we can control our levels of spending, we can control what we're doing. But I think that really just on what kind of message replacing the RCMP would send, I think it sends the wrong message. I think it sends the message of we want to disconnect ourselves from Canada as much as possible by removing, it's really a piece of Canadian heritage. The RCMP is very historic, especially here, because we used to be the former Northwest Territories where Mounties were everywhere. And I think by removing that part of our heritage, we send the message that Alberta wants to be isolated from Canada because of our grievances with Canada. I don't really agree with that. I think that what we're doing right now with the Alberta Sheriff's Police Service, replacing filling those gaps in coverage in rural areas, I think that's a good system so far to compensate for the failures of the federal government to adequately fund rural policing. But I don't think that we should go through with the full replacement of the RCMP.
Yeah, because the original plan was to completely replace the RCMP. Based off what I know about the original plan from the Alberta Next panel, was basically do what I understand Quebec and Ontario did and just have their own. But I think that the lack of support throughout the Alberta Next panel, there was a lack of support for it. And most people wanted to stick with the base RCMP. So I think Danielle modified the idea to be a smaller agency that worked along with and filled in those gaps. And, you know, I think the biggest problem is those rural communities. For people who live 30 minutes away from the nearest police station, you know, if crime ever happens in those areas, you don't feel very secure.
If I could, sorry. Our premier is very good at finding she'll come in with an idea and it might not be as popular with the public as she thought. And then she'll find a compromise that makes sure that the general purpose of the idea comes to fruition without it being divisive. Because the RCMP is a very big part of a lot of rural communities. Part of what I say about policing is part of the job of the police is to strengthen a community. And the RCMP has done a very good job at strengthening the communities that they have contracts with. So I feel like they have proposed a plan to transition RCMP officers from the force to the Alberta Provincial Police Force if they do go through with the full replacement. But I feel like most RCMP officers would rather stick with their own force, and they might end up just getting transferred to a different province, which would be really disruptive to communities that have strong relations with their RCMP. So I think that's why you don't really have much public support for a full replacement. I think the solution we have put in place is a good compromise, and I think that's the direction we should go ahead with. The RCMP, they have a strong presence in communities, so removing the RCMP would disrupt communities a bit.
I think how the RCMP is in urban areas is completely fine and it's effective. But again, the concern is the rural areas and the places 30 minutes out that don't have that immediate access to policing. And so when you have communities that don't feel safe, they need something to be there. And I think she wants to transfer 600 RC Alberta sheriffs into this police service. I've transitioned them into it, and so I think it's supposed to be like a very smaller scale, more out there, more ruralized. So I think the focus is those rural areas. So overall, what Danielle Smith has adapted from her original plan, I think is going to be not only better cost wise, but better for everything overall. Do you have anything else to say about that?
No, yeah, I completely agree. The
Okay.
other thing I would say is if we really want to keep people in rural areas safe, then we have to go through with. I believe this plan has been floated around, but I'm not sure if anything has gone through with it or if it even is a plan. We have to go through with making Castle Doctrine the law of Alberta. Because no matter what, we're not going to be able to build police stations in the really rural areas so that people can live 30 minutes away from their local police station. That's not cost effective. It can't happen. So many logistical problems around that. So what we really need is to make sure that rural Albertans can have firearms to protect their property and that they won't be at risk of criminal charges if they use firearms to defend their property and their family from intruders. Because really, when you live so far away from urban centers, the only person who will ever take care of you is yourself. Unfortunately, what we're seeing from the Liberal government is the gun buyback law, the really, really nonsensical, and even the or the public safety minister admitted that it was nonsensical gun grab, which is only hurting people who live in rural areas. I think that, if we look at this whole overarching problem of the neglect of the safety of people who live in rural areas, I think it's because we have a government that lives for the urban vote. And that's kind of just the matter of just a fact of life in Canadian politics. Both parties are trying to target the urban vote. Stephen Harper could only win his majority by making gains in Toronto and the GTA suburbs. So they're all trying to target the urban vote. Pierre Poilievre has expressed his whole crime agenda has mainly been targeted at urban crime in the GTA, which, to be fair, it is out of control. But we have very urban-centered politics that tend to neglect the needs of people who live in rural areas. And that's why we're seeing these kinds of problems that only seem to affect rural residents.
Yeah, yeah, the crime in as a person who lives in a relatively, I wouldn't consider myself rural, but I live in a rural subdivision, and I think it was a year ago, where my family just got back from a party. And so we're just sitting at home, and these guys show up and they went into my mother's car. They're checking out inside our house. And so it was scary because there's people looking into our house trying to see if we're not home. And so it's when we call the police, it takes them like 7 minutes, maybe even 10. I don't recall exactly how long it took them, but it took them a while longer than I was hoping for them to take. And every minute counts when it comes to crime. A minute could be life or death for a civilian in a rural community. So, yeah, it's definitely important for castle doctrine. If we didn't have our legal, I don't, should I say that on online, that
Legal boondoggle, right?
we have
Yeah.
legal weaponry that, we would feel less safe without it. And
Mhm.
so that's why the buyback is so nonsensical. It's just, I understand that some guns are just not appropriate in a civilized society. You don't need weaponry that could kill 15 people in 5 seconds. Those hunting rifles, those things that are mostly for either hunting or just basic defense. They're not as, I don't think there needs to be as a push to take those back. But I'll leave that on that. We should talk about the what do you think the costs of this Alberta police force? What do you think
That
about
is
the
an
cost that
interesting
could entail?
topic, actually. And I didn't want to get into that because there, I think it was in 2023, the city of Surrey in the greater Vancouver area, they transitioned away from the RCMP. The RCMP is a very big presence in the lower mainland area of British Columbia. BC is actually the biggest RCMP division. And there's a lot of cities that still have RCMP coverage in the lower mainland area. Surrey tried to transition away from the RCMP to a Surrey police service, and it took them like 2 years, and it was a costly mess, and it was super janky. And worst of all, you had politics in between that. I think their mayor got replaced with a guy who didn't support the transition, and then he got replaced again. The guy who did support the transition. And it was just a complete mess that cost way too much to the taxpayer. I think that we do have, at the very least, stable government in Alberta. I think that we are guaranteed to win the 2027 election if the NDP keeps going on their collision course. But still, and then you'd also have resistance from some municipal mayors who don't support the transition. I'm sure there are some out there. I think there would be a lot of complications when it comes to making that transition. Of course, this would all happen at the end of the RCMP's contract period, which expires in 2032, I believe. Yeah, expires in March of 2032. But I still do believe that there would be a lot of complications in that regard, just looking at the example of Surrey.
Yeah, the costs do concern me because the plan originally to totally replace the RCMP, they were estimating costs of hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of a few years because you have to buy the equipment, you have to build those institutions, you have to build that force, and that costs a lot of initial money, and it's a lot of initial investment that is going to dig into taxpayers' pockets. But this newer plan for just 600 sheriffs, I hope is only a handful of millions, which doesn't sound any better when I say it out loud, but comparatively to the original plan, it's cheaper. And then I'm weighing the fact that it's going to help a lot of rural communities. I think the good that we're going to get out of it definitely outweighs the costs. I would definitely pay a few more dollars in my taxes to ensure that police aren't 15 minutes away from my house when someone's trying to break in.
Yeah, and then the other thing, of course, is by not replacing the RCMP and instead having a supplement to the RCMP. And we already have the infrastructure for the Alberta Sheriff's Branch. They already operate. They already do highway patrol along certain major highways. They already have the infrastructure to be a sort of police force. I think that that is economically efficient. All you would really have to spend is maybe increased pay, so you would hire more officers and maybe increase space at their training camp, wherever they do that. But it is far more economically efficient. You won't have the hassle of trying to transition away, and there's already infrastructure there to have a quasi-police force.
Yeah, and it's I think because you see those issues with the original version where the costs were higher, there was less support for it, and but now with how Danielle has changed it, it's lower cost, it's not as ambitious, it's more supported. And so I think that this revision that she has done, it was a great thing on her part. And so I think the next thing we should think about is what exactly do we want this service, like what do we want these sheriff's people to be enforcing on their day-to-day routines?
Well, I want them to enforce the law. I think we have a very good system when it comes to how our police is structured. We have in most Alberta municipalities, I think maybe all Alberta municipalities, they have a peace officer service, and they're an unarmed service of not they're not registered police officers, but they're not sworn police officers, rather. But they operate in a law enforcement capacity. They can make citizens arrests, so that's more like a technicality. But their main purpose is to enforce traffic laws. And, in Sherwood Park, I see them all the time stopping some crazy guy who could end up crashing his car if he wasn't stopped. So we have a peace officer service to handle traffic violations. I think maybe they could be expanded to handle rural traffic violations, or that responsibility could be an Alberta sheriffs. I think maybe Alberta sheriffs would be the most responsible, the most effective way to handle rural traffic violations, because people definitely do drive. I don't live rural, so I wouldn't know, but I'm pretty sure people drive crazy rural. The stuff I've seen in Sherwood Park with traffic cameras everywhere, if they do that here, it must be really crazy out rural. So traffic related matters, I think, and they already do this, right? As I said, they have a highway patrol program. I think that would be one major responsibility. And the other one would just be, in general, having a presence in rural areas, just going around the roads, just patrolling. When people see police officers out in the street, they are less likely to commit crime because they don't want to go to jail. I don't think the most people in Canada want to go to jail. So just acting as that deterrence, I think, is already a major responsibility, a major load off the backs of the RCMP and of our rural Albertans.
Yeah, no, I think your idea of just a general patrol is a great idea. I'm going to bring in more, again, personal experience. This one's not my experience, but it's an experience of a family member. My rural family members, there was I don't know if I need a trigger warning for this, but there was a corpse outside of their, like, right outside of their property. There was a corpse in a car. And months later, they find a young, starving boy on their property who was kicked out by his father. And so there's definitely a need for there to be a patrol presence in rural Alberta. Because there's obviously problems here. My family should not be experiencing two different crimes within the span of a year. That's not normal. So I feel like that patrol presence is definitely important to have. They could have found this young boy sooner and gone him to a safer place. Or they could have, stopped this crime of this whoever it was getting murdered. And it wouldn't have to have been found by, I think it was a civilian. I might be wrong, but I think it was a civilian who found the body. So yeah, a patrol service would be great. What I wouldn't want is I don't want an Alberta Sheriff's Police Force to be enforcing federal regulations, especially in rural areas, because it's just going to be bad overall. Because there's a lot of legal gun owners in rural Alberta, where every time the federal government changes its regulations, their guns they've had for years just suddenly become illegal. So that gun enforcement for a rural police service would be kind of problematic and contradictory to what Danielle stands for.
Yeah, the topic of guns actually raises an interesting point, because to have a firearm, all of your firearms have to be registered with your local RCMP. And if you want to do anything with them, you have to get permission from your local RCMP. And the RCMP, most RCMP officers, they live in urban areas and they primarily service urban areas. So I feel like, urban as far as Sherwood Park would be considered urban. So they have a more urban understanding of firearms, and a lot of that is shaped by the commissioner in Ottawa and what he gets from the prime minister, of course. So I feel like if there was some sort of power sharing agreement between the RCMP in Alberta and with the sheriffs to handle matters related to firearm licensing, if that's possible, I think that would be a good way to reduce animosity in rural areas and have a police service that understands them better. I think that's something that we could look into. I'm not sure if it is possible, again, because this is all federal, right? We're not like the Americans, we don't have state laws. But if it is possible, that is something we should look into.
Because when you say that we need permission to do anything with our guns, if that's true, I'm going to tell you right now, we don't. We don't ask for permission. If we go out to our backyard and shoot a bunch of cans. It's just what happens. And in rural areas, there's a good chance you're going to hear gunshots from hunting or people just playing with guns. Well, I wouldn't say playing, but they're practicing and just enjoying the fact that they are a rural community and they do have this kind of culture in a way with gun ownership, which is something you do have. So I think a rural police service needs to be understanding of that and not very helicopter parent of it. It needs to be recognized that we need to recognize there are laws that do need to be enforced, but we also have to recognize that rural communities are rural communities and there are things that happen out there that you just can't infringe on.
And I mean, even on the topic of the gun law, right? I don't get why they're going after assault weapons. All of the crime in the GTA is committed with handguns, which are already thoroughly prohibited. The prohibition on long guns makes no sense. If I recall, because this assault weapons ban is actually pretty old, if I recall, that was a response to the shooting in Nova Scotia, which, I mean, really, instead of looking at firearms, they should have looked at the shooter's mental health history. And I spoke about this because, of course, now when we're on the topic of guns, there's the elephant in the room, and that was the tragedy that happened in British Columbia. And I spoke about this with our CA. I said that the issue in all of these mass shooting situations is that you have mentally unstable people in proximity of firearms, not firearms themselves. The conventional wisdom is guns don't kill people, people kill people. And in that Nova Scotia situation especially, police, they try the best that they can, but occasionally there are failures of duty. And in that case, the RCMP, they didn't alert the public, they didn't put out an emergency alert. And that ultimately led to people thinking, because the guy was going around in a stolen RCMP car with the full markings and everything, and he was posing as an RCMP officer, and that's how he got close to people and he killed them. The RCMP didn't put out an emergency alert in time. Maybe they didn't have enough information. I don't know. I'm not sure if an investigation went into that, but that was ultimately what led to that situation really getting out of control. So, and that, instead of leading to some kind of change, some kind of reprimand, somebody being held accountable, some kind of mental health action plan, which, by the way, was conservative policy during that 2021 election, having a mental health action plan. Nothing like that. Instead, the government just went to banning guns because, of course, the guns are autonomous and they kill people by themselves. I think it's just like, at the end of the day, all of these problems, they come from an institutional problem with the Liberal Party, I believe, where they always seek out the cheapest solution to anything, the easiest solution, rather than really looking at an issue and thinking, how do we find a long-term sustainable solution? So this happened in Cumberland County, Colchester County, and then he moved on to Kings County. Or maybe that's
Okay.
Hants County, I don't know. So yeah, the rural areas.
Okay. But I think the problem is that you have these mentally unstable individuals and they commit a crime, which is awful. And so the government looks at that and then their decision, instead of having a comprehensive plan to tackle mental health, they instead decide to punish I wouldn't say, is it millions? It might be millions, I'm not sure. Hundreds of thousands of rural gun owners who keep their guns locked up, who ensure that they're away from children and ensure that they're using their guns safely. And so that's where the grievance is with at least Albertans, and I'm sure rural communities across Canada, is that just because one person did an awful thing, and I feel awful for that, and it's a disgusting thing to do. It doesn't mean you punish hundreds of thousands of people who are doing everything right just because one person did something wrong.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, from the start, the assault weapons thing is flawed. Nobody can actually define what an assault weapon is. Right? Oh, it has a retractable stock. So do most firearms. Oh, it has this long barrel. So, right? Nobody can. 2.4 million gun owners in Canada get punished on the basis of something that nobody can even define. If you asked, I I think that the justice minister has been asked what an assault weapon is, or the public safety minister, Mr. Anand Sangari, he has been asked what an assault weapon is. He couldn't tell you. He's actually on record saying that the assault weapons ban is a stupid policy. If you ask the prime minister, I doubt he could tell you. Nobody actually knows what an assault weapon is, but they think they can just legislate on that. At some point, it's like the law is just saying we're going to ban bad stuff and we're going to unleash good stuff. And that is not how you make policies.
Yeah, I disagree. We're going to, overall, I think me and you can both agree that Daniel's decision for a more rural police forces overall on this smaller scale a great idea. I think we can
Yeah.
agree with that. Okay, so now we'll be discussing the May 29th protests by the Alberta Federation of Labor. Seth, do you believe that Gil McGowan's membership with the NDP has anything to do with this decision to have a protest?
Well, I'll say what I think up front. Look, I think that unions have a very important place in our society. I am very strongly pro-union, and I believe that we should be empowering unions to decide to come up with good collaborative agreements with their employers so that workers can have fair pay for fair work. But I don't believe that the Alberta Federation of Labor is a union. I believe that it has become a political association, a political party, even really. They have just become the supposedly nonpartisan wing of the Alberta NDP, and I do believe that what they are doing is simply for partisan reasons under the guise of protecting labor rights. Now, look, yes. Do they have a legitimate grievance regarding the legislation of the contract with the teachers? Yeah. Now, personally, I believe Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, and I might be going on a tangent here, but Lee Kuan Yew in the 80s, he had a problem with the airlines in Singapore. An airline union decided to go on strike, but they didn't, take up pickets or anything. What they did was they would go to work, and they would just work as little as possible. And that was actually illegal in Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew, he didn't just sit around and say, okay, do whatever you want. I'll give in to your demands. No, he said, you have two options. Either keep doing this, destroying the reputation of Singapore Airlines, and I will teach you a lesson, and the people of Singapore will help me teach you a lesson you won't forget, or stop it, restore discipline, get back to work, and argue your case. Those were his exact words in a speech he gave on the matter. Because he said, and this is a very famous quote, whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him or give it up. You have to be willing to take tough decisions in the interest of the people when you're in government. And I believe that's what Daniel Smith did, because you and I were both high school students. We were both denied a month of school because of the strike that they went on. And like they can argue for fair pay as much as they want, but they have to realize that there are students who are there actively impacting. Finals got canceled. I'm sure there were many students who were relying on finals to boost their grades. There's a whole lot of issues. And they also had to cut a bit of the curriculum as a result of this. And then they start blaming those problems on the government. Why? Because they're all supporters of the Alberta NDP. And I think I've gone on for a bit here, but I think that the whole union culture of using unions as a political organization, it's not just a problem here in Alberta. In Ontario, their public sector union, CUPE, they fired their boss, Fred Hahn, recently, and throughout his reign over the CUPE Ontario, he turned the organization into just a political party that talked about, Israel Palestine, that talked about transgender issues, abortion, stuff like that, that has no relevance to the workplace. We're seeing it everywhere, and I believe that the root cause really is minimum wage law. Because I think that, before, and there's countries that don't have minimum wage law, and they're often regarded as very progressive countries. Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, they don't have a minimum wage. Instead, they empower their unions to decide to negotiate collective agreements with their employers in collaboration, and they end up getting paid higher than most workers throughout the world because they do it by their own individual will and not by a government mandate. Here, what we've done is we've taken that social responsibility away from the unions to negotiate with their employers, but we've kept the responsibility of the employers to decide what the government thinks, to provide what the government thinks is fair pay. I believe that responsibility is reciprocal, and when you take away one side's responsibility, you get a bad deal. But I would like to let you get in on that. I've talked for long enough.
I think you bring up a good point about, being strong when it comes to negotiations and all that. And I think that's what a lot of people need to remember is it is a negotiation. Places like Finland have a lower I guess we're kind of off topic with the whole teachers thing, but I'll just finish this thought is that Finland has a lower spending per student than Canada, but they have the number one education in the world. And so they're doing it better for less.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the negotiations we should be having is, yeah, you want all this increased spending and all this stuff, but maybe we should be looking at other things. Let's see how we can do it better for cheaper.
Yeah.
But on the topic of if Gil McGowan's membership to the NDP is affecting his decision to do a protest, I looked at the AFL website and I noticed with the whole protesting situation and the whole anti-Danielle situation, I noticed a very lack of labor in their talking. They very rarely discuss unions or the issues regarding the workforce. Most of the grievances are the grievances Naheed Nenshi has with Danielle. So that leaves me to interpret that the AFL is just an appendage of the NDP. They're not,
Exactly.
It doesn't look like to me that they're fighting for workers' rights. It looks like because some of their concerns was like, the referendum, separatism, Trump, for some reason, they bring up a lot of things that have nothing to do with our workers. And so that doesn't make me confident that they're here to represent workers. And I think this protest that they are trying to plan is more to have political disruption within the UCP than it is to fight for workers. And that's an unfortunate thing because workers deserve that right to be heard.
I think the thing is just the result of the responsibility and the role of a union in society getting absolved over the years. And the party that has been doing it has been the parties that do it have been unequivocally on the left. The NDP were the ones who raised the minimum wage to $15. What they keep doing is they keep legislating away all of the things that unions should be negotiating with their with their employers. And the union bosses who don't want to do anything, they love it. They love it. So they will keep supporting the NDP. They'll keep going through with the NDP's partisan goals in the name of their in the name of the workers or whatever. It is so very clearly a partisan game, I believe. And I again want to enforce that I believe in the role of unions in society. I think they have to be strong. I think they have to be empowered as long as they are operating within reason and within the responsibility of class collaboration. What Jill McGowan wants is class conflict. He just wants there to always be two sides in society that are constantly fighting. Oh, it's the workers versus the elites. And that is just not how that just doesn't contribute to Alberta. That's not going to make Alberta better. It's only going to advance his own personal interests. And I think that if the AFL really wants to move ahead, they should fire Mr. McGowan and they should choose a leader who actually wants to fight for workers and actually wants to collaborate with employers and doesn't want to. You have to remember that union members and even non-unionized members, they are required to pay dues into the union. So what they're doing, using union funds to organize a protest for partisan reasons, it's wasting the money of many people who don't even want anything to do with the AFL and or with the Alberta NDP and their platform. There's conservative teachers out there who don't like what the teachers union does. There's conservative laborers out there who don't like what the union does. And there are very evidently conservative laborers, because you look at what happened with Pierre Poilievre and how he absorbed the NDP vote in the last election. He is actually winning the working class vote. So laborers are moving conservative and they are tired of the NDP's games. And still, the union wants to force them to pay dues into partisan NDP affairs. I think that's just really, really unfair and really a bad reflection on Mr. McGowan and his movement.
Yeah, and it is really unfortunate that this protest, it does have aspects to we're fighting for workers, but there are many aspects that just seem to be an NDP push and aren't reflective. And so that brings me to this idea with the protest and the principles this protest is being built off of. Do you think they are capable of doing a large protest against Danielle Smith and the UCP?
Well, no, because they don't have widespread support. Look, they can organize a protest in Edmonton, absolutely. We saw the teachers' protest, and that was pretty big because Edmonton is NDP country. But anywhere else in Alberta, they could not get support because everyone knows it's a partisan affair. Nobody thinks that there is actually a legitimate cause that is above politics that is worth fighting for when it comes to this protest. So they might get a big crowd in Edmonton. I don't think it'll go very far. I mean, look at Operation Total Recall. The average Albertan does not want to play the games of the Alberta NDP or of Jill McGowan or of any of the other NDP satellites. The average Albertan is and you look at the polls too, the average Albertan is ready to elect a strong UCP government. So maybe Jill McGowan should take the wake-up call.
Yeah, you bring up Operation Total Recall, and on the AFL website they do have that listed as something they are supportive and I think are working with. And it's another piece of evidence that it's not about unions, it's about politics. They also still have listed that they are planning a general strike, and I think that's ridiculous because the unions, the teachers unions and a lot of healthcare unions have gotten major wins with the provincial government last year, this year. 2025-26 has been big union wins for a lot of public sectors. And so the idea of trying to still push for this general strike is once again just proof to me that they're not really concerned about the well-being of these unions. They're more concerned with the well-being of the health and prosperity of the NDP party.
I completely agree. I think that it's important, we've identified the problem very well. I think it's important to understand to realize what the path forward would be for the UCP, because we're heading towards a kind of divide, even within the workplace. You have a lot of workers within a unionized workplace who do support the UCP, who hate what their union is doing. And what they are left with is they don't feel like they have a voice that will fight for them. And we have to think of a way forward to rebuild a stable relationship with unions as a party to ensure that no worker is left behind. I think, we're not going to, in how things are going right now, we're not going to be able to simply ask nicely for a good relationship, especially when the people who control the unions are very well aligned with the NDP. Actually, I forgot to bring this up, but as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but some union leaders actually have a seat on the NDP's provincial board. So that it is something that we have to, and we're concerned as we believe in gradual progressive change. We have to slowly move the unions away from this kind of partisanship. One way, and we'll break from the party's position here, I think that allowing union donations to political parties was wrong. I think same with corporate donations as well. There's a reason that they are banned. It's because only individuals should be allowed to influence the political process, not corporations or unions. The NDP, they have a large, or not the NDP, the AFL, they have a large war chest that they give off to the NDP every year. It's already that alone that encourages the NDP to continue pandering to the union bosses who don't want to do anything for their workers. And you get that feedback loop that keeps going and going and going, and is ultimately delivering worse for the workers. So we end corporate and union donations. I think that would be my first step. And then the second, I think, would be to start saying, hey, we support unions. We are a party that supports unions. We want stronger collective bargaining rights. We could even look into examining our collective bargaining law and strengthening that. And then eventually we should start handing more responsibilities off to the unions, and we should start encouraging them to find their own deals. And then eventually we can get to a point where we can abolish our minimum wage because we will already have a strong union culture like a country such as Denmark or Sweden.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I didn't even know unions were allowed to donate to political
That is a
parties.
very
That's
recent policy, by the way.
is it?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. If you are a representative of a group of people, like you are representing them as a whole, you should not be taking a one-sided position. That's just not fair, because there are going to be people that you are representing that aren't that. Of course,
No.
politicians get exceptions because they're elected to take sides, but your focus is to do what's best for your workers, not what's best in your personal belief. And
Yeah.
so I think that's ridiculous. And I think that further cements, my belief that or I guess our belief that this protest isn't going to be as successful as they're hoping, just because there's a lack of focus on actual workers' concerns based off what we know.
Yeah.
And so now we have to question what the AFL, or like a organization that represents many unions, do you think an organization like that has any place in Alberta's future?
Absolutely, they do. I think I made that point clear. I think that unions need to have a place in our society. I've spoken with people who think that we don't have a need for unions anymore because we don't live in, 1800s, do whatever you want, laissez-faire, I don't care capitalism. But there will always be a place for a union in society because there are real cases of workers getting undercut. There was for example, the Air Canada attendants who weren't getting paid for work they did on the ground, which was absolutely unfair. So there will always be cases where workers don't get a fair deal, where they don't get just pay for just work, and they will need a union to stand up for their interests in that case. But the way that they exist in their current state, we don't even need to abolish them. They're heading on their own collision course if we did want to abolish them. They are headed for disaster. They are headed for internal division. And they're doing it all so that they can, because they are so desperate for another lick of political power now that they blew their one chance in 2015. They're so desperate that they want to weaponize unions. I mean, it's just, and the NDP will always say, "Oh, we're the worker party. We were based in the labor movement." They're not now. They're the party of the college campus, and it's just really, it's a disaster. That's all I can really say. It is a big disaster for the workers of this province, and I hope that we can take steps in the future to get our province's union culture back on the right track, and we can restore responsibility to the workplace.
Yeah, because a union, I feel like a organization that, I wouldn't say governs, but is responsible for many unions, I feel like it does have place in Alberta. Like, it could be great for allocating resources supporting striking workers, because that's one of the biggest problems when you're on strike. You're not getting paid. You're not having any money to feed your family. So I feel like a Alberta Federation of Labor would be a great institution to gather donations and support those striking workers. But it's not. In the state that it's in right now, its sole focus in this moment is to destroy the UCP and play political games. And it's also asking, with the general strike, it's asking workers to go on strike again and to sacrifice more of their income just to give Naheed Nenshi a bigger boost in the next election. And that's not fair to workers. If they want to strike, that's on, they can do that. But it should be on their terms, not the terms of someone who answers to the NDP. And so I feel like the AFL can be great. And I think it can be good for workers. I mean, they have programs to help train people in, I think, Uganda. They have training programs for those people, and that's a great thing. And that's what they should be doing. They should be training workers. They should be helping our current striking workers. They should not be playing political games. Its only goal is for political parties. There's no benefit for the workers for that. And I think that's quite a shame.
Yeah, I mean, you can't even make the argument that they're supporting the NDP. I know that there will be people who see this and they'll make the argument that they support the NDP because the NDP is the only party that fights for workers. It wouldn't be unfair to say that we have introduced legislation that has helped workers. I mean, we introduced what is effectively a tax cut by creating a new bracket, an EU 8% bracket at the lowest. Right, that is a tax cut for workers. Why didn't the AFL come out and say this is a good thing? Meanwhile, the NDP, while they were in government, they quintupled our provincial debt, meaning that a lot of money that we collect in taxes from workers that could have gone towards social supports, that could have been reinvested in those workers' communities, instead went to foreign countries to repay our provincial debt. And it's still going to foreign countries to this day to repay that quintupled debt as we slowly cut that down under the prudent fiscal policies that we now have. If they really, really cared about the workers, they would stand up, they would critique both sides, but they don't. They're never going to critique the NDP. And I think that is the single biggest shroud of evidence that they are in the pockets of the NDP.
Yeah. So yeah, it is quite the shame that workers aren't getting the representation that they deserve. So thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any ideas of your own, feel free to tell us. We'd love to hear your feedback.